Hello, everyone. I'm Fred, and I'm here with Monica today to host a workshop about designing for accessibility. We'll be sharing some tips on how to do this with digital health products. But before we get started, we'll introduce ourselves quickly.
Right. Hi, everyone. My name is Monica Ramnarayan, and I am a product manager at Communicate Health. I have a background in public health, and so I've had the pleasure of working sort of in the intersection of public health and product design and development. And in my current role, I manage the development of many different types of digital products, from apps to websites to digital tools. We really cover a wide range of things. Over to you, Fred.
Sorry about that. Yes, hello, I'm Fred Vangeloven. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a user experience designer here at Communicate Health. I've been with Communicate Health for about 4 years, and I've been in the digital design field for well over 10 years now. I do typical UX design stuff like wireframes, task flows, those kind of things. And while we have dedicated UX researchers on the team here at Communicate Health, I also am pretty heavily involved with research, consulting on moderators' guides, weighing in on recommendations, all those kinds of things. And if you detect a small accent, that's because I'm originally from Belgium. I've been in the States for about 12 years now, and I live in Massachusetts with my wife, Laura, and my son, Felix. And that is all about me. Let's get into it.
All right, so today we're going to be covering some important context and considerations related to designing accessible products. And so after our session, you'll be able to explain what accessibility is and why it's important, describe tips, considerations. Sorry about that. Okay, so describe 3 tips and considerations for enhancing accessibility to digital health products that go beyond 508 compliance, and then write effective alternative or alt text for images. And throughout the workshop, feel free to leave questions in the chat, and we'll try to address them as we go. And then we'll also have some time at the end for folks to ask questions or make comments as well. So either one is fine with us. All right, so before we dive into the meat of our workshop, I wanted to take a minute and just share a little bit about Communicate Health and what we do. So we are a mission-based communication firm serving a range of federal and state government clients, as well as for-profit and nonprofit organizations. And we approach our mission, which is to improve lives by designing health information, products, and digital tools that are easy to access, understand, and use, with a strong focus on plain language, accessibility, and usability. In an effort to reach as wide an audience as possible and effectively meet their needs, we practice human-centered design and inclusive design. And so I'll pass it over to Fred to chat a little bit more about what those are.
Thanks, Monica. So first, let's talk a little bit more about what human-centered design is. If we want to improve lives, we need to consider real people and their actual needs. And that's why at Communicate Health, we follow a human-centered design process that, as the name indicates, puts humans at the center of the process. This means the people who use the product are considered every step of the way. There are different ways to slice and dice the phases. But here at Communicate Health, we like to make sure we start with empathize. We need to know and understand who we're trying to help and why that's important. And in the context of health literacy, it's especially important to consider your audience. Maybe your audience has lower than average health literacy. And probably your message is important enough to make sure that it reaches its intended audience and has its desired outcome. Again, this process puts the audience at the center at all times, which is also why I want to make sure I point out the test phase. It's important to test your product or service with actual people. the actual users, and you need to mimic the setting, the real world use as close as possible. The phases in this graphic are laid out in a circle. That's because human-centered design is an iterative process. You probably won't get it exactly right the first time, and that's okay. And because you are dealing with real people, things can get a little messy sometimes, but that's okay too. People can be unpredictable, and it's important to embrace uncertainty throughout the process. Human-centered design is how we work because we believe it's the only way to design for accessibility and with inclusivity in mind. So with the how out of the way, let's look at the what. At CH, our guiding beacon in everything we do is inclusive design. But what is inclusive design? Inclusive design considers the full range of human diversity. This gets at humans and how humans are a diverse bunch. And your audience probably is too. As you design products, you need to consider diversity of all kinds: neurological, cultural, technical, situational, and more. Accessible design, our main focus today, is part of this. But as this definition shows, inclusive design is broader than just accessibility.
Yeah, and when you think about accessibility, you might picture users with physical disabilities like vision or hearing impairments. But building accessible products can also help users like people with low literacy skills or low health literacy, people who have neurological conditions like dyslexia or attention deficit disorder, which can make reading and information processing difficult for them. People living in rural areas with limited broadband service, and also people who don't have a computer and access the web only on a smartphone, which is actually 1 in 5 Americans.
I really like to think of inclusive design as a practice. It's baked into everything I do. And that's important because it needs to be considered every step of the way. It can't be an afterthought. It simply doesn't work like that. And while 100% inclusive design is probably unrealistic, it's important to remember that every step towards it counts. As you design and build digital products, it's important to remember that you are not the audience. In some cases, you might be a member of the audience, but the audience is diverse.
And the fact that diverse audiences use your products is why research is such an important part of the inclusive design practice. I mentioned earlier that building inclusive products can help a large range of users, especially those that are often excluded. And testing with real people who have real accessibility considerations can help make sure that you're including as many audiences as possible. And kind of what Fred mentioned earlier, there's really no substitute for this. So some ways that you can practice inclusive research include using data collection methods that make it easy for these audiences to participate. So choosing research locations that are accessible by public transit, offering a range of times, including evening or weekend sessions, or allowing people to join remote sessions from a wide range of devices, including smartphones. Providing cash incentives is also a great way to be more inclusive. And it's also important to consider community-based or alternate recruiting strategies. And when analyzing data, considering the whole context, so thinking about who's your audience, what is their social and cultural environment, and making sure that that context informs how you present your findings and recommendations. Because when we test with more diverse participants, we get richer feedback and ultimately can create better, more accessible products. And I'm going to take a quick look at the chat here and see if we have any questions. All right, we don't have any questions. So Fred, I'll pass it back to you to chat through accessible design.
Thanks, Monica. So yes, let's take a closer look at how accessible design plays into all of this. So first, I want to emphasize why inclusive, accessible design really matters. I'm sure we can all agree that everyone deserves to have equal access to our products and services, and this is true across many spheres. But in health communication, the consequences can be particularly dire. When it comes to health communication, access and inclusion are public health issues with real consequences. When thinking about inclusive and accessible design, we need to think beyond the narrowest definition of accessibility. Simply making sure something is technically accessible is limiting and inefficient. We've all been to restaurants where a wooden ramp was added to the stairs in order to make the building accessible to people who use a wheelchair. But if that ramp had been considered a part of the design from the start, the outcome would have been a better, stronger solution. If we design for accessibility, we make products that work better for everyone. Here's a concept that really illustrates how that can work for everyone. Solve for one, extend to many. We all have abilities and we all have limits to those abilities. That's why there are different types of disability. Disability can be permanent, like it is for someone who's born with one arm, or it can be temporary, as it is for someone whose arm is in a cast, or it can be situational, like when someone is holding a baby.
Oh, can you go back one slide, Fred?
Sorry.
Okay. All right. So if you think about it, everyone benefits from accessibility, including Gary, who's often sleep deprived because he's the parent of a young child, Kate, who has trouble with memory because of chemotherapy, Daniela, who sprained her wrist and has to type with one hand for a few weeks, or Carlos, who lives in a rural area and only accesses the internet via smartphone. All of these potential users may have different accessibility needs when they're using digital health products. So you might not necessarily relate to any of the examples I just shared, but the reality is that we all become less able with age. Disability isn't always a permanent or born with state. And the Census Bureau found that when asked if people have difficulty going through the activities of daily life, twice as many people report having serious difficulty with specific daily activities. And for context, the questions in this survey asked about things like walking or climbing stairs or having serious difficulty seeing even when wearing glasses. And so by this standard, 30.4% of Americans over the age of 18 self-report as having some sort of disability, which is a pretty big number. Most of us are born without these difficulties, but with age, we acquire them. And the tipping point where most people now have trouble with one or more of these daily activities is somewhere around the age of 67. And so imagine how many people you're excluding or inconveniencing if you don't consider them when designing your products and services. Designing with accessibility in mind really has the potential to impact everyone who uses your product. And so that's why when designing for accessibility, it's key to consider it at every step of the way. Going back to that example that Fred shared a little bit earlier about adding ramps to restaurants, consider this. Wouldn't it be so much better to build in the ramp as part of the original design? This picture of a bathroom illustrates this idea of built-in accessibility beautifully. Providing a well-designed low sink is so much better than adding an ugly, hard to use, and potentially dangerous step stool as a bolt-on solution, which you can kind of see in the bottom picture there. When using a bolt-on solution, or bolt-on approach, it creates inefficient solutions. For example, people who use wheelchairs wouldn't be able to use the step stool to access the sink. So using a built-in approach really allows us to identify the best opportunities, and often these options are only available early on in the design process. Another concept I want to talk about is 508 compliance. Just to get a sense from folks on here, and feel free to just note this in the chat, how many of you are familiar with 508 compliance? Is this a term that folks have heard before? Or is it pretty new? Okay, got some yeses, got a not really, new. Okay. Okay, so it looks like we're a little bit of a mix here. So we'll definitely take a few minutes and just talk about what 508 compliance is. So Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act requires access to information and communication technology, or ICT, that's developed, procured, maintained, or used by federal agencies. So what that means is federal agencies are responsible for ensuring that their information and services are accessible to people with disabilities. And the definition of what accessible means in this context is captured in what's known as 508C standards and guidelines, and the C stands for compliance. 508C standards have requirements for things like color contrast, minimum font size, and alt text. And they also aim to make digital products like websites usable with assistive technologies. So these are things like screen readers, braille readers, and voice input devices. And we'll share an example of how a screen reader works actually a little bit later on. And as the word suggests, this is a bare minimum standard. So if you're responsible for designing and building a digital product, you really should shoot for more than just meeting the 508C standards and guidelines.
So usability goes beyond basic access. For a product to be considered usable, it needs to be easy to use, and it needs to address a need our audience actually has. Usability is obviously key to designing and creating digital products, because if what we build can't easily be used or isn't useful, then what's the point? The more usable a product is, the more accessible it will be. And this usually goes both ways. More accessible usually means more usable too. A ton of research has been done into this, and a lot of recent really smart people have thought a lot about it. So there are great resources to be found that explain usability best practices for pretty much anything you can think of. We'll get into some practical examples later. For now, I want to reiterate how important it is to test your products. Simply assuming they are usable is not good enough. There are tools that help you run automated tests to look for accessibility issues, and that's one way to test your product. At Communicate Health, we also like to do usability audits. A usability audit benchmarks a product or service against a predefined list of parameters. An important part of a usability and accessibility audit is the consideration of assistive technology. You always need to answer the question, does this work with assistive technology? But in the end, there is simply no substitute for testing with real people. Let's take a look at a couple case studies of how testing with real people helped us create better products. But before we do that, let me make sure there aren't any questions in the chat. A few minutes ago, Heather actually asked if there's research on the most effective digital platform to reach patients with patient education, for example, via email, phone, text, or EMR chart. That's a really interesting question, Heather. And I think it really emphasizes the point that we've been making over and over again, that because the audience is so varied and there is no clear definition of who the patient is, that depends on the situation. I think the best way to reach those people is also dependent on the situation. So in some cases that might be via email, but in other cases that might be via text or EMR chart or whatever. So I would answer that question with, you kind of need to do your research and figure out who your audience is, and then figure out the best way to reach them.
And I'll also just add, I think the communication channel that you use really depends on what your communication goals are and what you're trying to accomplish for that audience. And if the goal is really to create behavior change and make sure that people are kind of engaging in the behavior that you're trying to promote, it's really important to kind of think about like, what are those communication goals ahead of time, do your research, figure out who your audiences are and what they need, and kind of go from there.
Thanks, Monica. And I saw Robin asked about usability audits and if there are any specific ones we recommend. So we have created our own usability audits at Communicate Health. But what we did is we took the 508 compliance standards and guidelines, and there are checklists for those out there. So we started there. Then we did some further research into broader usability audits and integrated those checklists. And finally, we also continuously tweak our usability audit based on things that we learned from our actual research with real people. So yeah, there's not really a specific one that I think I would recommend, but I really like the fact that we created our own so that we can continuously iterate and tweak it as we find out new things that are important to look for.
And also, I'll just mention too that there's another resource that we've pulled from in our work a lot, which is the Nielsen Norman Group. They are well, I guess Fred is a little bit more familiar with them than I am, but they have a whole lot of best practices and research that they do in terms of figuring out what's the best, what the best user experience practices are for digital products across the board. So websites, apps, things like that. I don't know, Fred, if you have any other context you want to share. And I can add it in the chat too.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Monica. Yeah, Nielsen Norman is a great resource because, like I said before, a lot of smart people have thought a lot about this, and they are one of those smart people. They've done a lot of research, and they share a lot of best practices on their website, freely accessible. They also sell white papers and research result reports that that go deeper into the things they share publicly. But even the public resource is a great resource to just kind of get started and learn a lot about very specific things. If you're looking for a very specific component or interaction or something, they probably have something written about it. Anne just asked if we can share a link to this organization. Yes, and Monica just did. Right above your chat, there's a link to the website. It's nngroup.com. So let's take a closer look at a few examples. So the first case study we wanted to talk about is the My ALS decision tool. We built a tool for the Les Turner ALS Foundation to help people living with ALS make decisions about managing their symptoms and care. The primary audience for this tool is people living with ALS and their caregivers. And the tool will include several modules, each about a specific topic. But after we built the prototype for the first module, we decided it was time to test it with the actual audience. So in designing for specific audiences, there's always unique challenges. And this was especially true in this case because the challenges people face when living with ALS change a lot as they progress through their journey. So to make sure the tool would be accessible and useful for the widest possible range of people, we focused on a simple and clean design. We knew it was important to put the user in control, so we kept that in mind as we designed solutions. So for example, we know people with ALS can struggle with fatigue and they might have trouble focusing for a long time. So we made sure to provide shortcuts to skip ahead, and we also made sure it's okay to take a break and come back to the tool later. Of course, we made sure the tool can be used with a variety of assistive technologies, such as screen readers and voice input. And we also considered that people might rely on their caregivers to use the tool. So one of the things we noticed was that the Les Turner brand guidelines fall just a little short of 508 compliance guidelines. We brought this up with the team at Les Turner, and they were very open to making improvements. So we tweaked the color palette just a tiny little bit to make the contrast higher and make sure, and we also made sure that all the text is sufficiently large. So as you can see on this slide, the color palette retains the same look and feel, but it's now a little more punchy. The difference is pretty obvious when you put the two color swatches side by side like this, but in the actual context, most people won't notice that we even made tweaks to the palette. So what did we learn when we tested this with the actual audience? Well, we learned that the updated color palette definitely helped with legibility, but we also found evidence for the need to go above and beyond 508 compliance. Even though we checked all the boxes in terms of color contrast and font sizing, people still wanted to see larger and bolder fonts. We also learned that the other things we did to go above and beyond the 508 compliance guidelines were noticed and well received. Because of the specific challenges people face when living with ALS, the specific challenges when it comes to fatigue and mobility, we knew it was important to set clear expectations upfront. So we created this introductory page that explains what to expect, and we provided a progress bar at the top of all the pages. In this case, there was no need to let people know upfront that what they would need to complete the tool, but when somebody will need something to complete a task, like for example, a driver's license number, it's best to let them know upfront. You don't want to be in a situation where someone takes the time to go look for their license, but then comes back to an application that has timed out. And speaking of which, we carefully avoided anything that could introduce unnecessary friction. There's no need to log in, save your progress, or allow cookies with this tool. And I understand that might not always be possible. In some situations, you can avoid these things because of security considerations or legal requirements. But when you add something that creates additional friction, always ask yourself if there's maybe an easier or just another way to handle it. Because the information in this tool is pretty technical and because the message it communicates can maybe be hard to receive, we knew it was extra important to consider plain language principles and design a tool with a conversational tone. I could keep listing little things we did to go beyond the checklist, but the last one I want to emphasize is that we provided multiple options and multiple paths through the tool. This enhances the sense of control and makes the tool work for a wider variety of people and situations. For privacy reasons, I can't share the recordings from testing, but I wanted to end with a couple quotes from our participants. One person said that they really appreciated how the tool walks you sequentially through the thought process. And another one emphasized that people living with ALS might feel out of control, but that the tool does a good job at giving them a sense of control. This person pointed that out in the context of the tool, the voice and tone, and the actual interface. He pointed out that the tool, the voice and tone, and the actual interface all work together to achieve this sense of control. And before we move on to our next case study, I'll take another look at the chat to see if there's any additional questions. Felicia asked, how do you engage grassroots organizations in the creation of digital messaging? Oh, wow.
I can share a few thoughts on that, Fred. So involving community partners is really important, not only for creating accessible products and effective messaging, but also just to understand how to effectively share information. And so at Communicate Health, we've partnered with groups like local literacy centers, for example, to share input throughout our design process. And that's also helped inform some of our promotion and outreach tactics to make sure that the materials that we're making, will reach the people that they're intended to reach. And then we've also had some grassroots organizations work directly with us on, some smaller pro bono projects. We had, I believe, a community-based campaign to promote calling 911 for opiate overdoses. And in those cases, some of the organizations are kind of involved throughout each step of the communication, planning, and implementation. So they really kind of see things from start to finish, and are informing that process as well.
Thanks, Monica. Yeah, and this is a really great question, Felicia, because it also makes me remember that it's not always super easy to actually find the audience. And like I said, you want to test with people, with actual users, people that are actually in the situation that your audience will be in. That's not always super easy. And we've gone about this different ways, but reaching out to grassroots organizations or nonprofits, or anyone who works with your specific audience can be a good way to find people and to meet them where they're at.
Right. So for our second case study, we are going to take a look at the National Eye Institute's website. So in September of 2019, the National Eye Institute, who we refer to as NEI, launched a redesigned website to better meet the needs of its users. The website has two main goals. The first is to provide users with eye health information that's easy to use, actionable and relevant to their needs. And then the second one is to provide users with the latest eye health news and research opportunities. Our primary audience is patients and their families, but we also do have a few secondary audiences that we keep in mind, which include eye care providers, researchers and grantees, funders, policymakers. There's a whole range of them, but those are some examples. And Communicate Health supported NEI in redesigning and building the website. And as part of this process, we took some steps to ensure that the website not only met but exceeded accessibility standards. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the things that we did to do that. So people with low vision are an important audience for NEI. So we paid extra attention to building in accessibility features to cater to them. And those included supporting reduced motion settings, enabling high contrast mode, and enabling the ability to zoom and increase text size across the website. And these are really basic accessibility features that you can build into your digital products to enhance accessibility. So ideally, you're kind of starting here and going above and beyond these, but simply being mindful of using large enough font, for example, is a great place to start. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these accessibility features and what they are. So the first one here, which is reduced motion. So the NEI website works on a user's browser or device's prefers reduced motion setting. And this is really helpful for people with vertigo or motion sickness, and it reduces or stops animation and motions on a web page just to kind of keep things a little more stable. And then if you go to the next slide, yep. So high contrast mode is another accessibility feature. So here's an example of what this looks like. So the image on the right shows the NEI website homepage in high contrast mode. And this is a display mode that prioritizes making content as legible as possible. And you can turn this feature on your computer or mobile device settings as well. And users can view a website with a dark background and light text, which can make it easier to read. It's often used by people who have low vision so that they can better see color contrast. And this is even something that they can use even if the contrast on the site is already 508 compliant. I'll also add that even though this feature helps folks who have vision impairments, it can also help you, if you're out on a sunny day and it's hard to read your phone screen, kind of getting that contrast can be helpful for you as well. And this is a great example of an accessibility update that benefits everyone, whether or not they have a disability. And then the last accessibility feature I'll highlight is the zoom and increased text size feature. So these images illustrate what that feature looks like. And you can see that when users increase the text size in their web browsers, the site layout automatically adjusts so that the text fits the width of the page. So that's you're seeing on the right side of the screen the 200% zoom compared to just the regular zoom on the left side. So what this does is it allows users to not have to scroll from side to side in order to read a page, and they can zoom in up to 200% without losing any clarity of content. So we designed the site with these basic accessibility features in mind, but in order to make sure that we went above and beyond basic accessibility, we conducted usability testing with our audiences. I know we've been talking a lot about that today. And in fact, we've conducted multiple rounds of testing on the site over the last couple of years. And as I mentioned before, people with low vision are a priority audience for NEI. And so we really made sure to get their input as well. And we actually just wrapped up a study with low vision users and have a couple video clips to share from those testing sessions, which I'd like to do now. So the first one is a clip of a user attempting to search for a term, but they misspell it and they don't get any search results. So let's take a look at that and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
Let's see. Can't see it now. Can't take over. And because I know that I drive. Okay, let me go. Okay, no vision and okay, how many? I driving. Oh, disability. Sorry, we didn't find anything. Can't see light driving. Search another.
Were you able to hear that okay?
I think I was. Were other folks able to hear that?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. So as you can see, the website we know is technically accessible and in compliance with 508, but this person is still unable to access the information that they're looking for. And this would be more evident if we were testing with a low literacy audience. And even though that might be the case, we all make spelling mistakes every now and then. So this is really something that is something that anybody could experience. So, as you design, it's really important to think about these types of usability issues that go above and beyond the checklist. And in this case, we recommended to our client that they provide a list of commonly misspelled terms that we can account for in order to make sure that the correct results show up, even if somebody misspells a commonly used search term. And the other thing I wanted to point out is just kind of bring it back to the concept of situational disability that Fred mentioned earlier. And I think that's really applicable here. Misspelling a search term could be a result of, for example, using the speech to text feature on your phone if you're not able, to type for some reason. And you might say eye health, and your phone could spell I with the letter I. And so, that's just another example of how, you could end up in this situation and, you're just kind of using a different feature on your phone. And so, this just really goes to show how accessibility benefits everyone, and accommodating people with, limited literacy or situational disabilities, can really broaden the accessibility of your product. All right. So, right, if you go to the next slide, great, thank you. So here's another example of some feedback that we receive in usability testing with low vision users. We tested with a user who uses assistive technology to navigate websites. And in this case, they're using a screen reader. And so what a screen reader does is it reads the content of a website for people who have low vision. And for images on a page, a screen reader will describe them using something called alt text, which we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at later. And so this video shows a user navigating a section of the NEI website using a screen reader, and we'll kind of take a look at how that goes for them.
Okay.
So then the language, I'd have to
Language,
choose
text,
English.
menu item, English, menu item. Topic, text, vision and aging, banner.
And then,
How to apply. National Eye Institute, learn about NEI for kids, link, complimentary.
wait a second.
So tell me what happened there.
It seemed like my computer jumped, so I lost my place.
Okay.
National Eye Institute, link, learn about eye health, text, complimentary, learn about eye health, text. Grants and training, text.
So
Training at NEI, outreach materials, text.
there's outreach
Search
materials.
our library of hundreds of
Oh,
materials.
okay.
Main.
It jumped back up to the
Main.
top, so I lost my place.
Okay.
Topic, text, vision and main. Type of outreach material, text. Type of main.
Type of outreach.
Type of outreach material, text. NA, pop, booklets and brochures, fact sheets, handouts, fact sheets.
I'm gonna do
Menu item.
handouts.
Type of outreach material, banner. Research at NEI, research labs and branches.
Okay, now I know
link.
what's happening. It's just gonna pop to the top. Let me see.
National Eye Institute,
When I choose
complimentary.
something, I think it's gonna pop back up to the top.
That's the end of the clip, Monica.
All right, thanks, Fred. So yeah, so that's how a screen reader works, and we'll, like I mentioned, talk a little bit more about alt text. But basically, what the screen reader is doing is, we've kind of coded in alt text for different images, and we've also made sure that each of the different features on the web page are labeled appropriately, so that when the screen reader is going through the page, it's appropriately dictating the navigation of the page. So a user with vision impairment can do that effectively and have a really clean user experience. So making a website accessible to assistive technology is actually a part of 508 compliance. And like I mentioned, having alt text is important, but it's actually quite an art to make sure that it's really helpful for folks. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about what alt text is, and we're going to do a little activity around it. So I'll pass it to Fred to kick us off with that.
Okay.
So then the language.
Sorry about that. There seems to be a little bit of a delay when I advance the slides. Before we talk about alt text, I wanted to quickly address a question Malcolm asked in the chat. Assuming you create an accessible public health oriented website utilizing health literacy best practices, do you have any recommendations on how to make it available in more than one language? Yes. Unfortunately, there is not always room in the budget for this, but we definitely always advocate for providing translations if possible, and especially if you've identified in your audience research that a large part of the audience might speak a different language, then it's very important to make sure to provide that additional language, whichever it may be. So we always advocate for it. We have Spanish language experts on our teams. We have Spanish language content strategists. We have Spanish language writers. And we will work with any additional experts if we need any languages that we can't support in-house. But I guess the short answer is yes, always advocate for it, but also you have to be realistic about things like budget and just practical feasibility.
And I'll also add, Fred, that when we at Communicate Health do translations, we actually kind of approach it from we actually call it transcreation. And so what that basically means is that, you're not kind of applying this like broad, like Google Translate type functionality to a web page and it's kind of spitting out the content in a new language. You're really, being intentional about, how you're translating. You're leaning on somebody who, has that language expertise and, having them capture the nuances of the content in the language that you're trying to translate into. So I just wanted to put a plug in for that, and making sure that when you are doing some kind of transcreation, it's you're kind of taking into account that cultural relevance and all of that.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Monica. Because obviously when you do translate your content, you want to make sure that you maintain the same voice and tone that you had in your original. And also sometimes this requires design tweaks because, for example, the Spanish language content, it's often longer. So maybe button labels or menu items, when you translate them, they don't fit as well in the container that you originally had designed for them. So that's what Monica was trying to get at with the transcreation piece too. Sometimes this requires design tweaks as well as simply translating the content is sometimes not enough. So before we talk a little bit more about alt text, let's do another poll. And if you could mention in the chat if you've ever written alt text before. I see another good mix of yeses and nos. Yeah, looking at it in a very unscientific fashion, it looks like we've got about a 50-50 split. So that's great. Let's dive in and speak a little bit more about it. So what is alt text? Alt text is short for alternative text, and alt text describes an image on a web page or in a document. And in this image, or in this example, you can see that the alt text describes that this picture shows a person in a wheelchair dribbling a basketball in front of a basketball hoop. So where do we encounter alt text? It can be found in a lot of places, for example, on the web, but also in documents such as Word or PDF documents. It increasingly is becoming a part of social media posts, and also in emails, there is alt text behind the images. So why is this important? Well, it's important because it makes the content and the function of the image accessible to a few different situations. So the first one that comes to mind is assistive technologies, such as screen readers or braille readers. And remember, these assistive technologies aren't just for people with low vision. Someone might use the built-in screen reader on their device because they find themselves in a situation where they're unable to look at the screen and read the content. But alt text also makes the information accessible to browsers or email clients that don't display images, or when those images fail to load. And it also helps make the meaning of the image clear to the search engine robots that read your website for search results.
Right, so let's take a closer look at how we write alt text. When writing alt text, there's a few best practices to keep in mind. The first is to be concise and avoid redundant information. Describe the action or relevance. Use qualifiers like race, ethnicity, gender, or age intentionally, and use punctuation. And so we'll talk a little bit more about each of these in detail. Typically, we want to be concise and avoid redundant information with alt text. For example, excuse me for 1 second.
So while Monica deals with her technical trouble there, I will take over. So Monica was explaining that we'll want to be concise and avoid redundant information. So for example, adding image of or photo of, that's usually redundant information because the screen reader announces that it's reading an image when it gets to the alt text. And I see Monica is back, so I don't know if she wants to take over again.
Sure, thanks, Red. Sorry about that, everyone.
No problem.
So there isn't really a hard and fast rule for how long alt text should be, but keeping it under 125 characters is a good goal to aim for. And of course, there may be times where you need more than 125 characters to describe an image, and that's okay too. And in those cases, you might want to consider a caption and how your alt text fits best with them. And so in this example to the right, a screen reader would probably would read both the alt text and the caption. And if you find that you're adding too much detail in the alt text, a caption may just be a better option for you. So, the takeaway here is to really be intentional about, what you're putting in alt text. Think about, are there pieces of information that could go in a caption? And making sure that both the alt text and the caption are distinct so that you're avoiding redundant information. So describing the action or relevance of the image is helpful so that people who are using a screen reader can understand why the image is accompanying the content that they're reading. So in this example, the image has alt text that clearly states what's happening. So the alt text is a child washing their hands in a sink. So from this alt text, we know who is in the image, it's a child, and we know what they're doing. They're washing their hands in a sink. And then finally, it's important to be really intentional about including identifiers like race, ethnicity, gender, or age. Generally, age is difficult to determine based on how someone looks. And race, ethnicity, and gender are complex identities that include physical characteristics, but are not something that we can assume just based on a person's appearance. And teasing this out is really where context becomes really important. And we're going to talk a little bit more about context when writing alt text in a few minutes. But just to kind of give you a preview, for the image on the right, the alt text may be different depending on where you're placing it. So on a page with tips on staying active as you get older, you might describe this image as two older adults taking a walk, since age is relevant to that page. But on a page about staying active in general, age isn't really that relevant. And so you might describe the same image as two people taking a walk. So with that, let's do a little bit of practicing. And before we do that, I think we have a couple images a couple of questions in the chat here. So the first one is from Karen. Can you review the eye example again? I'm not sure what we would write here and how one might explain a complex eye image, for example. So yeah, so that's a great question. I think, and this example is actually very, very, very tricky. And we talked a lot internally about, what the best alt text for this would be. I think ultimately you really just want to think about what does somebody really need to know when they land on this image. And if you're able to kind of use the caption to add more detail, the amount of context you really need in the alt text is a lot less. And so because the screen reader is going to really read both of those things. So, you might be able to describe this image as, a detailed image of an eye or something like that. And you can kind of keep it a little bit more high level. And then, the caption will really help kind of explain a little bit more of the context behind it. Fred, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on.
Yeah, so like you said, it's tricky, and that's part of why we're practicing this today. But yes, when you have the caption and the alt text playing together, you really want to think about, so someone will hear or has heard the caption already, what additional information do they need about this image? And in some cases, that might even be, there is no need for additional information about this image, and the image becomes decorative, which is something that we will talk about in a few minutes here. But yes, it's tricky, it's subjective, but you really need to keep in mind that longer alt text might be better as a caption, and they work together. The screen reader will read both the alt text and the caption.
Great. And then I think we had two other questions in here from Mindy. Is the word mature adults considered PC? That's a good question. I'm not sure.
I'm not 100% certain either. And that's why, we, Monica and I, we're not the content experts on our team. We have writers that know about these things. And I will already give a little plug for our newsletter. We have a newsletter every week that talks about exactly these kinds of questions. But anecdotally, I have never seen our writers use it, and we typically say older adults, I believe, or adults, but older adults in this situation. And the next question from Rebecca about Latinx, it's kind of like the same answer. We're not the experts on words, but I do think we've used the term Latinx, I believe, and we would go to someone from that community for advice on that. So we would reach out to a Latinx person and ask how they feel about it and what's most accepted in the community that is in play.
And that's something that we've debated a lot, at least our content team has debated a lot at Communicate Health. And yeah, like Fred mentioned, it really depends on who your audience is for that.
So Steve asked, you said detailed image of an eye. I thought we shouldn't say image of in alt text. Yes. So that is, that's correct. You shouldn't say image of, but if that's the information you're trying to communicate, like this is an image of an eye, then that is okay to use as the alt text. But that is why I pointed out that maybe in that situation, if you're just gonna say parts of the eye, and then the caption explains what those parts of the eye are and how they are relevant, then that image probably becomes decorative, and you probably don't even need alt text at all. And then how does the reader read cornea, pupil, etc.? Is it cornea above pupil? So the reader doesn't read any of those words in the actual image. That's what the alt text is for. So if you wanted to make sure those terms are read out loud, you would have to put them in the alt text, and you could say something like detail of the cornea, the pupil, etc., and kind of explain and order the words in the order that you want the screen reader to read them. A few people weighed in on the use of those terms that we talked about before, so I encourage everyone to kind of read through the chat and see what everybody is sharing about that. And Larissa asked about if captions or alt text are which is read first by the screen reader, and how valuable is it to provide rich visual descriptions, and in which situations. So which is read first depends on the order in the code. So typically most captions come after the image. So the alt text would be read first and then the caption. But you could, if there was a need for that, you could flip that and put the caption first in the code, and then the screen reader would read it first. But typically, I would say it would be alt text first and then caption. And how valuable is it to provide rich visual descriptions, and in which situations? That really gets to how much information do you need to communicate about the image in the situation that you find yourself in. And we'll talk a little bit more about how different situations change that essentially in just a minute.
So with all of that, let's do a little bit of practicing. So I'd like for you all to just take maybe about a minute and write some alt text for this image. And as you are ready to share, and if you're comfortable sharing, feel free to drop your alt text in the chat, and we can discuss from there. So I'll be silent for about 30 seconds and give folks some time to think. And I see we have a question here. Can we have information on the context in which this image is being used? That is a great question. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about how context is important in the next section. So right now, we just want folks to write alt text for this image, not really thinking too much about the context. Okay. So I'm seeing some options come in here. We have person skateboarding, person smiling while skateboarding, female wearing a hat skateboarding, person wearing a hat with tattoos, skateboards in a skate park, young woman skateboarding, person skateboarding. Okay. Yeah, these are great. And I think this just really goes to show that there's a lot of different, alt text is very nuanced. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you could describe this image, a lot of different details that you could pick up on and, share as part of the alt text. And, as a couple folks were asking about, that's really where the context becomes important. And that context can really help you determine what those important details are. So with that, I'll pass it back to Fred and talk about context.
Thank you. Yes. So we saw from the examples people were giving that the level of detail really comes down to what's the context this image is being used in. Because, for example, you might want to point out that it is a sunny day because that might be relevant to the situation. The same Monica was saying about older adults. Sometimes it might be relevant to mention that, sometimes it might not. So speaking more about context and how that comes into play for alt text, there's something like that's called decorative images. So decorative images don't add any information, so they don't need any alt text because it doesn't really help the person using a screen reader to know that this is a picture of flowers and stars and swirly things. And so in that case, you wouldn't include alt text, but there is some nuance to this because on the web browser wants the alt text attribute, which is a small piece of the code, to be there because otherwise it will try to read something else, like maybe the file name of the image or something like that. But that's not really something to worry about for us because we're not developers, but the developers would have to put the alt text attribute in the code just to make it easy for the screen reader to know this image is decorative. I can just skip over it. I don't need to read anything here. And like I said, we don't need to worry about this. I just wanted to make sure I mentioned it. And if anyone has any questions about that, I would happily try to answer those. Functional images are images that can be interacted with. So maybe the image is a button or maybe it's linked to a different page. And in that situation, the alt text should not describe what the image is of, but it should describe what will happen when the image is clicked. So in this example, the print button has alt text to clarify that the page will be printed when the button is clicked. So let's practice this a little more. We're going to write some alt text for this image. So now instead of just writing alt text for the image without considering context, we now have 4 different situations that this image can be used in. The first one is as an image in an article that's titled Older Adults 5 Tips for Staying Active. The second example is if this was on a product page for a Shimano road bike for brake levers for the road bike. And the third example is if this was on a dental practice homepage. And then the final example we'll try to write alt text for is if this was in a grid of activities with a link to cycling workout videos attached to it. So we're going to break out into smaller groups and we'll take about 10 minutes to discuss and come up with alt text for this image in these 4 different contexts. And then we'll all come back to the main Zoom and we'll talk about it and share some ideas. You might want to take a screenshot of this slide because I don't think you'll be able to see my slide deck while you're in the breakout room. And then we're not going to designate any moderators for the rooms or anything like that. So please try to participate. And I know that's not always easy for the introverts among us, but we're all learning here. And the best way to learn is by doing and participating. So please try to participate. And remember, there are no wrong answers, unless maybe you describe this as a person playing basketball. That's technically a wrong answer, maybe, but you know what I'm trying to say. So yeah, we'll break out into breakout rooms, and then we'll take about 10 minutes and come back here at 10 to 3 ish and talk about what we discussed in our smaller groups. Monica, are you able to break folks out because I don't see my Zoom controls?
I think we have our host who's breaking out everyone.
Wonderful.
So yeah, so you should all, I think Fred, you and I can maybe stay here. Do you want to join a group?
No, we can hang here.
Breakout rooms are up.
Thank you, Brian.
So at 10 till, I'll close all the rooms and bring everybody back.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
No problem.
I was in the room by myself, so I came back to the main room.
Oh no.
Oh, I was too. I'm Helen. I was in number 5.
Me too.
Yeah, I was
For
in
the,
room 14 and I was there for like about 5 minutes by myself. So I just came back to the main room.
Yeah, me too. Same problem.
All right. Well, Brian, I think, well, since we only have a few minutes left, I apologize that you didn't get a chance to meet with other folks, but if you want to take a few minutes and just kind of think about alt text for, oh, let me turn my video on, alt text for this image just on your own. And then when we come back, if folks want to, we can share out.
If they go back to the breakout rooms, I can assign them into a room that's active. Seems like not everybody joined their assigned room.
I think that's okay. If folks are interested in doing that, just send a note in the chat. I know we have about 15 minutes left, and I do want to make sure that we wrap up on time for folks. So
All right, coming back in 15 seconds. And back in 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, there's a 60-second timer for it to close. Thirty seconds. Ten seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Thank you, Brian. Okay. I think we are all back. So let's discuss how that went. Does anyone care to share? I believe you should be able to unmute yourself. But if not, maybe you can use the raise hand feature.
Oh, sure. Do you want any? How do you want
Hi,
to
Heather. I
pick?
think we can hear you.
Okay, want me to share? All right, share screen. Yes. All right, there you go. So this is what we had. Is it big enough for everybody to see?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So for our article titled Older Adults, 5 Tips for Staying Active, we had number 1, an older person wearing a helmet is riding a bike outside and smiling. Should we go through all 4 of ours? Okay. Product page for Shimano road bike brake levers or levers. Casual biker enjoying a ride on a Shimano road bike. For dental practice homepage, we kind of got a kick out of that one. We said an older bicyclist showing a healthy smile. Link to cycling workout videos. We weren't quite sure on that because we didn't know if they were internal like workout videos for inside or not and whether the guy was outside, but we ended up just going with click on this image of the person riding a bike outside. I didn't quite have enough time for that one.
Thank you. These are great though. Yeah, it really shows, how wide the range can be of what you actually want to put in the alt text. And I think you did a great job at, keeping in mind the different things like context and level of detail needed for the specific situation. I think we have a little bit more time if someone else would like to share.
Like Julie, you have your hand raised. Would you like to share?
Sure. I can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, I raised my hand only because I accidentally had shared in the chat before we came back to the group, hoping that it would just go to our group. But so let me just I'm trying to let me share my screen. So ours were a little bit longer. So the first example we said was smiling older adult riding road bicycle while wearing a bike helmet. And that was for the tips for staying active. The second one for the Shimano road bike page, smiling older adult riding road bicycle while wearing a bike helmet, hands are positioned on the brake levers. The dental practice homepage, smiling older adult with white straight teeth, riding road bicycle while wearing a bike helmet. And we thought, do we need to mention the bike helmet? Well, maybe they want to know that he's practicing safety and protecting his face. And then for the link to the workout videos, click on this image to view a cycling workout video.
Thank you. Those are all great too. And yes, the question about do we need to mention the helmet? Do we not need to mention the helmet? That's the kind of stuff that you will debate as you construct your alt text for different situations in different cases. I see a few other people have shared in the chat, so that is great. Thanks everyone for participating. And like I said before, these examples all really show how it's different for different situations, and there's different levels of detail that you might want to communicate. Let me share my screen again. 1 second. So yes, because there are no hard rules when it comes to the level of detail you want to include, what is the situation this image is used in, alt text is somewhat subjective. And it's tricky because of that. It's really hard to know if your alt text is perfect or if there's room for improvement. But the good news is, if you try to follow the rules or the guidelines that we shared today, you are probably doing an amazing job, because all those examples we just saw were pretty good, if you ask me. So why is the slide deck not advancing? Here we go. So let's talk a few takeaways. Monica, do you mind taking this one?
Yeah, sure thing. So just a few takeaways on alt text. If you take nothing else from this activity, please remember these things. Think about what you want the user to understand about the image. So this could really eliminate the need for content, as Fred mentioned with the decorative alt text, for example. Think about the context as you write alt text. So consider if the image conveys information that's important to understanding the page. And then finally, remember that alt text is subjective. As hard as it may be to accept, and I know it is hard for me sometimes as well, there might not be a right answer, and that's totally okay. The important thing is that you're making an effort to accommodate a larger range of users, and that is a great start.
So let's recap quickly. How do you create accessible products? Well, at the very least, you'll want to familiarize yourself with the basic 508 compliance rules and guidelines, or standards and guidelines. And hopefully after today's workshop, you'll also want to go beyond the basics. So here are 3 specific things you can do to go beyond the basics. First, consider how accessibility benefits everyone and how there are 3 different types of accessibility issues: permanent, temporary, or situational. Also, take plain language principles into account when considering accessibility. Make sure to address your audience appropriately. And finally, think about general usability best practice and how these affect accessibility. For example, try to set clear expectations up front.
And then circling back to the human-centered design process that we touched on before, putting actual humans at the center of your design process will help you create inclusive, usable, and accessible products. When you bring real people to the table, you have a much easier time understanding them and their needs. And like we said, human-centered design is iterative, and sometimes it's a little messy. And the same can be said for accessible design. Accessibility is something that can always be improved on. Even if you follow the standards and implement the guidelines, chances are that there's still some improvements that can be found. And that's okay. Remember that every improvement counts. So we just wanted to share a few resources with you all. And this is in the slide deck that I believe folks have access to. But here's just a few, there's a lot of different resources that are out there, and we're just sharing a few just to get you started. The first one is an alphabet of accessibility issues, which is a great set of case studies or scenarios. It has 26 people with different permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities, and it shows how those impact how they use the web. And then we also shared a resource here from the Web Accessibility Initiative. They provide a decision tree that helps you decide if you need alt text and what it should describe.
InclusiveDesignPrinciples.org, which is the third one on the list, is a great resource if you want to take a deeper dive into the broader topic of inclusive design. And Health Literacy Online provides research-based best practices in creating websites for people with limited literacy skills and limited experience using the web. And last but not least, I already made a plug for our very own We Heart Health Literacy newsletter earlier, but I want to make that plug again. This is our weekly newsletter about health literacy, and it regularly touches on accessibility and inclusive design. So as a bonus, I will also share 2 more resources in the chat real quick. I see we're just about at time, but I wanted to drop these in the chat and really mention that accessibility and inclusive design are a hot topic right now. So there's always more resources coming out, and there's always great things that you can kind of lean on to incorporate this in your day-to-day job. So I don't know if we have time for additional questions, because I think we're just about at time.
Yes, we are at time.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you everyone for joining today. It was a pleasure talking to you all, and I hope you found it very informative and useful. Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Oh, Fred, do you mind just pulling up the slide of resources again? Somebody, I don't know if that person's, if Malcolm is still on, but.
Yeah, I'm still here. That'd be great. I was trying to get a picture and I didn't.
Sure.
No problem. 1 second. Can you see that?
Yep. Thank you so much. Got it. Thank you. Thanks for the great
Welcome.
presentation. Have a good day.
Thank you, you too.
Bye.
Bye.